Hello, everyone, and welcome to Yellow Jazz Black Music, a conversation with Dr. Marquitas Presswood. This webinar is hosted by the Long U.S.-China Institute, and we are very grateful to our co-sponsors for helping to make this event a reality. I'd just like to thank them very briefly: the Africana Institute for Creation, Recognition, and Elevation, or ACRE, UCI Illuminations, the UCI Humanities Center, the Center for Asian Studies, and the UCI Departments of History and Dance. So we will get started in just a minute, but before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to get everyone back in the documentary mood by showing the trailer of Yellow Jazz Black Music while people continue to filter in. So I will play the trailer now to jog everyone's memory and get you back into the spirit of the documentary. So I will go ahead and pull up the trailer right now.
Jazz was an international phenomenon.
Most of the musicians were American, Russian, Filipino. By far the most influential were African Americans.
African American musicians had left America for China, escaping racism at home, looking for economic opportunities abroad, and also to play the music they love.
Local Chinese people start hearing it and start wanting to play around with this new kind of rhythm.
并没有出现特别明显的，比如说爵士乐手。
By the 1960s, the music was effectively eradicated from many of China's public spaces until the early 1980s.
Yeah, the jazz scene here, wow, it's changed a lot. The general characteristic, I would say, in the beginning was very wild and unruly. In this way, it's dissociated from its African-American roots.
You know, will there ever be something like a Chinese jazz, a Chinese style?
Because all the Black American music and jazz is an expression of a culture, literally, in a time period and a circumstance. And if you can't experience that, you're just playing notes.
The native jazz force rising right now. Where it go depends on us though.
Why jazz need to be same?
All right, so now that everyone's memory has effectively been refreshed, I would like to introduce our speakers for this event. Dr. Marquitas Presswood completed his PhD in history at UC Irvine in 2020, where he researched the history of African Americans in China and Chinese cultural productions of Blackness. He is currently a leading edge postdoctoral fellow at the American Council of Learned Societies, and Yellow Jazz Black Music is his first full-length feature documentary. Dr. S. Ama Ray is an associate professor of dance at UC Irvine. She is a former fellow of the UK National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, and she received her PhD from the University of Surrey. Professor Ray and I will be moderating this event. For the first 30 minutes or so, we will be asking Dr. Presswood some questions, and then for the remainder of the webinar, we will open it up to audience Q&A. If you would like to ask a question at any point, please do so using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. In the last 20 or so minutes, we will collect the questions and ask them on your behalf. And in total, this webinar will last for approximately 1 hour. So I will turn it over to Dr. S. Ama Ray to get us started. So Ama, over to you. You'll have to remember to unmute yourself. There you go.
Great, thank you for organizing today, Dr. Baum. Really happy to have had this opportunity to share this film. I am so delighted, Dr. Presswood, that this space is here. UCI was your space of developing your inquiry, and we've prepared a few questions for you. But before we get started really into the meat of those questions, I'd love you to share with us why you decided to make this film at all.
Oh, that's a good question. First of all, thank you for having me here. I'm really delighted to be back at my alma mater and having this forum and talking to you all. Early 2000 was my second stint in China. I met a man by the name of Liu Yuan, who is, I didn't know, but at the time he's considered sort of the father of modern Chinese jazz. But I walked into this club in Beijing and I saw this Chinese man playing this very complicated Sonny Rollins tune. And he was just all in there with the rhythms, the intricate rhythms. It was a calypso he was playing. And it was just beautiful, just really just amazed me. I was just standing there with my mouth open, just like, this guy's great. I gotta like go meet him. And we met and we became, not, if not friends, associates over the years. And I did have a chance to interview him way back in the early 2000s. And I lost that film, can't find it. But he was a huge fan of John Coltrane and he was a huge fan of Grover Washington Jr. And if anybody listens to jazz, you know, Grover is like this sort of R&B kind of like player. And he's one of my favorite saxophonists. So that created an instant bond between us. Fast forward, when I got to graduate school, I started working on my dissertation. I always remembered that experience and I always tried to incorporate, you know, learning more about jazz and the music in China in that space. And during my research, I came across some very interesting figures who were living and studying jazz in the first half of the 20th century. And that led to partly to this topic of what happened in the early 20th century in China. And the rest of the documentary is about what's going on now.
Fantastic. So
Marquitos, you are obviously a historian. You wrote your dissertation on the history of African Americans in China in the 20th century. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, perhaps contextualize the history of jazz music in China against the backdrop of the broader history of African Americans traveling to China during the time period that you were studying.
So in the early 20th century, African-American music, particularly blues, jazz, ragtime, and there's a period where ragtime music and jazz are kind of synonymous with one another and viewed as being the same. But during the early part of the 20th century, Black music kind of takes the world by storm. It's this very new avant-garde rhythm, infectious rhythm that's on the offbeat. It's not, you know, on the 2 and the 4 or 1 and the 3 in the same way that Western European music is. It's a new beat and it's infectious and the whole world is listening to it. And so you have, you know, steamships traveling around the world. You have these different metropoles of colonial spaces. And in all of those spaces, you have musicians traveling to those places because there's a market for it. Particularly in Europe, in Asia, there's a huge market for musicians who play jazz to go and do so. And they're getting paid quite a bit of money. So there's this lure to go out to Asia to take advantage of this new marketplace and to have some adventure.
And how did China influence jazz? Or how did it interact with the peoples at the time within their own culture? So the music came, the musicians began to play. How did it affect the culture around it? And how did the culture around it affect the playing of it or the cultural, social spaces in which it blossomed?
Yeah, I would say that, oh, that's a very complicated question. But I would say that Shanghai in particular and was a very unique space in terms of being this place where you had these various different foreign powers that had concessions within Shanghai, the French concession, the international concession, the Japanese concession. I mean, so you have this hodgepodge of different internationals in this very small space. You also have, you know, Russians who are fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution, who find their way to Shanghai, because at that time you didn't need a passport, didn't need a visa. You could just go to the port and you can enter the city. You also had a lot of money in that space, and not just sort of Western money, but you also had Chinese money in this space. So remember, in during World War I, the Chinese entrepreneurs and bankers were responsible for sending resources to help these Western powers fight a war amongst themselves, right? So during that time, you get a lot of Chinese capitalists and bankers who bankroll and who are actually, you know, making quite a bit of money during this time. So all of these things converge on Shanghai to create this space where you have affluent people, you have a burgeoning middle class that has some disposable income, and people want to be entertained. Shanghai was known for its amazing nightlife, right? That was on par with any place in the world, right? And the music traveled with that. And African-American musicians were seen as the best players, the best people to play this authentic jazz music, right? And so when they find themselves traveling to a place like Shanghai, the word gets out, right? They start to, hey, if you come to Shanghai, you can make, you know, upwards of one musician was making $600 a month. And that was $600 during that time was enough to buy a brand new car. I mean, so the purchasing power parity of the money that some of these musicians were making was amazing. So they're in Shanghai, they're playing. Buck Clayton, who is a trumpet player who eventually gained fame working with the Count Basie Orchestra, he writes in his autobiography that they were horseback riding, they were, you know, getting their clothes tailored. But they also, for some of the venues they had to play in, they had to learn how to play Chinese songs. They had to transcribe music from Chinese folk songs to, as he called it, their Western scale, so they could play the music. So they got a chance to play Chinese popular music for, you know, audiences there. And he said in a very short time, they were playing the music like it was their own, right? So there's something also about jazz that was very conducive to absorbing these other folk musics, because it doesn't just happen in Shanghai, it happens all around the world. But jazz, which is based on, in some large part, on the pentatonic scale, and so is a lot of other folk music throughout the world, it lent itself to taking those sounds and absorbing them, reflecting them, and creating with them, and in a way that, again, was very unique for that time period. And then when Chinese people and musicians are hearing this music, you know, they start to play it. They start to pick up instruments and start playing jazz music. They're going into the movie theaters because a lot of the music and the soundtracks in the movies from the West are, you know, big band music. It's swing, it's jazz. And so they're in the movie theater transcribing the notes and playing in the nightclubs at night. So they're also wanting to sort of this new sound. And then lastly, again, as I mentioned before, you had a lot of Chinese money in Shanghai. So they start to build these very immaculate clubs, competing with one another for, you know, the best designs, the best nightclubs and spaces, and to have jazz played, right? So it's a huge market in Shanghai for a while.
Amazing. I'm just going to sort of elaborate just a little bit on that question related to the kinds of musicians that you shared in the film, but I'm just wondering, are there any that actually had the lion's share of their careers, or if you will, the heyday of their careers in China as opposed to the US? Or did, yeah, let me clip it at that.
Okay, so Teddy Weatherford, I think he first came to China around 1925 with Jack Carter's band. He didn't leave China until early 1930s. He left a couple times to go recruit some more musicians, and I think he went to Paris once. But he was in Shanghai for almost a decade, until 1934, I believe he left. And he went to India, and he actually died in India. He contracted cholera, but he spent the majority of his working career in Asia. He worked in Chicago with Louis Armstrong up until about 1924, 1925, but the rest of his life is spent in Europe, in Asia. I also talked about Valida Snow. Valida Snow also spent a lot of time in Asia and Europe as well, probably mostly in Europe. And that's one of the reasons why we don't know about Teddy Weatherford or Valida Snow, is because the majority of their career was spent in Asia, in Europe. They were making a considerable amount of money. They had a large degree of fame and stardom. So there was really no need for them to go back. They were enjoying their life in Asia.
Doing very well, thank you very much. Over to you, Emily.
Maybe I can just tag on to the line of questioning that Amma had started. And so you were talking about how jazz was this truly international phenomenon. It was something that had gone global. So can you talk a little bit about what the jazz scene looked like in Asia beyond China? I think in the documentary you gestured a little bit to the jazz scene in Hong Kong and maybe even Taiwan or Japan. Was there a large jazz presence in these regions as well?
Yeah, Shanghai is viewed as the Mecca of jazz in the first part of the 20th century, but you do have these other spaces where jazz becomes very important as well. So his name is Fumio Nanri, I believe his name is, and he's a Japanese trumpet player. He's considered sort of the godfather of Japanese jazz trumpet, or the Louis Armstrong of Japan, so to speak. But he was in Shanghai during the time Teddy Weatherford was there, and Teddy Weatherford actually met him, and he took some lessons with Mr. Weatherford. And that's one example of how musicians were there learning from each other. And so Fumio Nanri, he goes to the US, but he goes back to Japan, and he winds up, sort of becoming one of the leading figures of jazz in that country. Also had, again, in Japan, military bases. This is, after World War II, that is. So you had musicians there. You had Japanese, again, playing the music way back in the 20s and 30s. So when they went back home, they were still playing this music, and there were clubs, jazz clubs in Japan where Japanese people were going listening to the music, right? So this was sort of like, if you think about it, the hip hop of its day. Jazz was the hip hop of its era. It was ubiquitous. It was everywhere. Even before 1949, when the Communist Party takes over, you had jazz in Hong Kong. You had jazz in Taiwan. But you get influx of people leaving Shanghai, leaving southern China, heading to Hong Kong and heading to Taiwan, where you have the Canto pop industries develop, right? And if you listen very closely to Canto pop or pop music in Taiwan, you can hear the jazz inflection. You can hear the jazz influence music in the singing, the chord progressions, and it sort of fits. So there's a huge dispersion before 49, but after 49, definitely another huge dispersion of people, musicians to those places. And because there's more freedom in Hong Kong and Taiwan in that sense, they create these very canto pops allowed to, manifest itself and grow in a way that it didn't, in mainland China.
I see we have a few questions that have come into the Q&A. Should we take a couple of those?
Yeah, actually, since Marquitos, you were just talking about Japan, maybe we can entertain one of these questions that is also interested in Japanese influence on jazz music. So this question actually comes from my colleague, Professor Heidi Tinsman, who is a professor in the history department here and also the chair of the department. And she writes, Marquitos, congratulations. I really enjoyed this documentary. And she wants to know a little bit more about how the Japanese occupation of China during the Second World War impacts the jazz scene. She says, it seemed from your film that by the end of the war, there are more Chinese jazz musicians than ever before. Why is that? Did Japan tolerate or even like the jazz scene?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you, Heidi. I appreciate it. So a few things happen at the start of World War II. So World War II starts in 1937 in China. And at that time, you still have several African-American jazz musicians who've stayed, in the country. And initially, the Japanese don't bother them. And it wasn't until the attack on Pearl Harbor that Americans were rounded up and put in concentration camps. Yes, the Japanese also like jazz. There are several jazz musicians from the Seattle area who were in a concentration camp, and they talk about how they were, they would give concerts, playing jazz as well as other music for the other detainees or interns, people who were interned in the camp, as well as for the Japanese guards, right? On the one hand, they had to play jazz music to entertain their captors, but they were also treated very poorly and beaten. There's one musician who's a guitar player, and he writes about how he was constantly wrapped and his hands were constantly beaten, but he was also forced to play. I mentioned a short time ago about Fumio Nanri, the Japanese trumpet player who was a jazz musician. He actually was in Manchuria in northern China during the Japanese occupation of China, playing there for a little while before the end of the war. So the last part of that question was, I'm sorry.
She wanted to know if Japan tolerated or liked the jazz.
Yes. Jazz was, the people very much liked the music, and they still do. During the occupation, there were a number of jazz clubs. Jazz never in Japan, as one author wrote, Dr. Atkins wrote, it never took on the sort of cultural politics that the music took on in the United States, right? The Japanese musicians weren't playing and trying to fight the power or fight the system. Jazz in Japan became more of counterculture, a way to dress, a different fashion style or a different music. It was sort of a push against, societal norms and how people were supposed to behave and interact within Japanese society. So that was the main difference. But yes, there were a lot of Japanese fans of jazz. There still are a lot of fans of jazz in Japan.
Amma, do you want to go ahead and ask another question?
Sure, I have got a bit of background noise, so please excuse me. So as you may not know, inside of our audience today are a lot of jazz dance students. My students here at UCI are here, and they've watched this film, and I'm hoping that they will engage in supporting this space with a question. And I'm going to help them by provoking you to think with us, Marquitos, what is the significance of dance inside of this bringing of American culture? Because much of this music at the time was built out of a very, very, very strong relationship with the moving, dancing, spirited body. So can you tell us how that formed itself?
I mean, that's a really good point, because dancing was central or sine qua non to like jazz music, especially during this period. I mean, it was one of the reasons for having the music. It was a dance music. And in Shanghai, people went not just to listen, they went to dance. These are like taxi clubs and cabarets where people paid tickets to dance with women, you know, to this music for other things, but it was a dance music. One of the things that was really interesting that didn't really come up in the film, because I had to make narration choices, but one of the things that I discovered in my research was that the foxtrot was essential to like early jazz dancing, and the foxtrot owes its creation and the music that's played to African Americans. So in America, there was this dance couple, Irene and Vernon Castle, who were socialites. They were dance instructors. They popularized a lot of dances, popular American dances that went global. And one of these was the foxtrot. Initially, they were teaching this one step, and it was a very fast trot. And there are two musicians. One is a man by the name of James Reese Europe, or Jim Europe, some people call him, who was a very influential composer, arranger, band leader, and another man by the name of Noble Sissle, who was partly responsible for the first African-American Broadway play, Shuffle Along. So they were close associates with the Castles, and Noble Sissle sort of tells the story how when they were watching the Castles teach this dance move, they were saying that this is untenable, this is not going to work, it's too fast. People can't dance this fast all night long, you know, and they're in their cocktail gowns. They need a slower dance. And so Noble Sissle and Mr. Europe came up with a slower two-step dance that allowed people to sort of saunder and dance to a beat or a rhythm. Europe used W.C. Handy's St. Louis Blues as the basis for the dance that became the foxtrot. The foxtrot became a rage globally in Shanghai, in other metropoles, and other places around the world. As a matter of fact, there were plenty of dance schools in Shanghai teaching the foxtrot that became sort of the essential dance to learn, you know, when dancing to jazz. And the music that accompanies that, as well as the dance, has a great debt to give to those African Americans who were right there, who started it all. So when you look at albums from that period, you also see foxtrot or blues foxtrot. So from the 1920s, 1930s, all the way up to the 1940s, you'll see the label on records saying foxtrot, blues foxtrot, jazz foxtrot. And this is basically a blues or a jazz dance or blues dance, right? So the foxtrot is essentially an African-American form of dance. The Castles themselves even admitted that, yeah, we got this music, we got this dance from, you know, the African-American community, right?
So do you imagine there's yet more research to be done in this area in terms of China and jazz, looking at the embodied side of the music?
I think someone could do something on, definitely do something on dance in China, dance and jazz in the first half of the 20th century. Actually, I think that book can run up all the way to the present, right? Because, you know, I'm generalizing here, but Chinese people like to dance. You know, there's a huge, you go to Shanghai or Beijing today, a major metropolis, you'll see people like dancing in the evening, you know, ballroom dancing, you know, doing two-step. So dancing is a huge part of that culture, but I definitely think there's more to be said about the influence of of Black dance globally, and how that's influenced, you know, dance styles and dance sort of rituals in China. That definitely be something that I would not, well, I'm not a dancer, but one of your students could definitely pursue that kind of work. Again, there are a large number of dance schools in Shanghai during this period, teaching the foxtrot, teaching the tango, which is another, I consider another Black dance, right? You know, but so you can go down that rabbit hole and really do some research regarding those dances in Shanghai. There's a lot there.
Wonderful, wonderful. Great.
Actually, well, one of the people that you interview in the documentary is Andrew Field, right? Right. He wrote a book called Shanghai's Dance. So if you're interested in the history of Shanghai during this time, you could also check out that book. But maybe to turn it from dancing to history questions, I'm a historian, and one of the things that I was so intrigued by in your documentary was just this footage that you have of Shanghai in the 1930s and these jazz musicians. So I want to know where you got this footage and this audio from. Where did you find these sources?
Secret. No. At the end of the at the end of the film, I definitely put the archives where I got the footage from. But one of the archives was the University of Kansas and Missouri. University of Missouri, Kansas City. There is Buck Clayton's archive is there, and Buck Clayton is the trumpet player who played in Shanghai from 1934 to 1937, and he eventually got a job with Count Basie's orchestra. But he has an archive there, and he has some pictures that he took and some his wife took, and they're there and they're digitized. And that was a great source. And then there's also another archive out in Seattle, the MoMA, and they have a lot of nice high resolution photographs of some of the Black and Filipino artists from Seattle who went to Shanghai. And so that archive is there, and I was able to get a number of nice images from that archive. Yeah, and the music came about like really just going through the stacks and researching. Most of this music you can't find. I was trying to find records when I was in Shanghai, when I was in China, going to but you can't find the records anymore because they were made from these old shellac records, and shellac is like a resin, and they're very brittle, and you have to take care of them. A lot of them were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution, or it just weren't taken care of. So you can't find any of the music on wax anymore from that period. But there is some stuff that's online that some people have found and uploaded. So I was just listening to a lot of that music. And one day I came across this track by Joe Schran, who was considered, the golden voice of that period in Shanghai. And the song Two Roads I found. I was like, oh my God, wait a minute. And I'm listening to it, and I'm listening to the bass line of the piano, and I was just like, this is jazz, And then she started singing, like blues notes. Blues notes are like flatted thirds, fifths of like sevenths of a scale. And she's singing these blues notes in this song. And I was like, oh my God. And so I just did a deep rabbit hole on when did she do this? Who wrote it? Who wrote this song? It was very interesting, a very epiphany just to hear this person sing this kind of music. It was just very fascinating for me. I couldn't find anything else that was similar to that in her catalog, but that was a great piece of music to find.
I have another question that relates to these cultures coming together, and thinking about our student body now here at UCI. We have many students that come from China, and hopefully there are some who are here today. I'm wondering about whether they know anything of this history before coming to the United States. And then our Asian populations not necessarily having this entry point into history before now. We might have come to this film having no understanding of a direct connection between Asian and African American cultures. But your documentary shows a real intimacy and a blending between them. And I'm wondering, what does this intimacy between cultures in the 1920s and 30s imply for relations between peoples and cultures today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I remember I was in the airport some months ago, and I think I was flying back from China, by the way. And I met this one gentleman, and he said, "Hey, what are you doing?" I said, "Working on this documentary." And he says, "What's the documentary about?" And I tell him, "Oh, it's about African-American jazz musicians in China." And then he looked at me and laughed and said, "That's going to be a very short documentary." And he walked off. And that was, you know, I didn't give him a second thought, but that was one of the reasons for this documentary, because you don't often associate African Americans or Black people with China, or China with African Americans, vice versa. But there's actually a long history of people who are considered Black or African, you know, in the Chinese littoral, in the Chinese space for over a millennia. And this is just one of those stories. This particular documentary is just a very more recent iteration of one of those stories, but the history is there. We just have to go and sort of resurrect it. So that's one thing. So I always like to tell people that, you know, globally, we've always been around the globe. We've always been interacting with one another. Chinese people and people who are Black have always been interacting. This is nothing new. But it was unfortunate that I didn't find in the archive lots of instances where Chinese musicians and, you know, African-American musicians were working together in concert in the 1930s and 40s. I was looking for it, and I didn't find anything. You do have some writers in the 30s, you know, who are writing about the jazz clubs and African Americans in the jazz club space, right? And some of those writings are, some of it's otherizing, some of it's more leftist writing, but I didn't find a lot of that there. I know it's there, but it's just it was just very difficult in the archive in China the time that I was there. Fast forward to the present and what's going on now, it's as if Shanghai didn't skip a beat. It's basically reclaimed its position as the place where people not only in Asia, but people from other countries go and learn to like play jazz and play other music and other kind of rhythms in that space. Because a place like Shanghai with 20-something million people, as D.L. Kroger alluded to in the documentary, there are like 2 or 3 major jazz clubs in Shanghai. That's a lot for one city, but they're packed almost every night, right? There are lots of people there, people who are, some of them are fans, they go all the time. Some people are just, oh, business trip, gonna stop in, take my clients. And there are some people who are just curious about it, right? But whatever reason, those clubs are packed. Every time I went, when I was on my dissertation trip, I mean, I would go and it was just like standing room only in these places. And the musicians I interviewed, both Chinese and Westerners, really loved the scene, right? Because you're at the same musicians who were playing everything. The same musicians who were playing jazz music were the same musicians who were playing salsa bands and rock and roll bands and pop bands. But there is this melding and meshing of like ideas and people that were taking place. and people were finding out, you know, where they fit in. So Shanghai has become a place where so many disparate groups of people can go, and jazz is really about self-expression and about finding who you are, right? The instrument becomes an extension of your body, of yourself. And Shanghai has become one of those places where you can go and sort of figure out who you are if you're a musician, right? And there's a very open space to do that, right? So more than, you know, I've been in the New York scene, I've seen how that operates, I've been to some other places, but Shanghai it's pretty open and they're pretty welcoming, and I'm hopeful that that environment will remain a place that will be an incubator for not just, you know, people learning the music, but also a lot of well-established jazz musicians go to Shanghai, right? You know, I've seen Joshua Redman there, I've seen Branford Marsalis, Wynton Marsalis has been there. Some of the young, Robert Glasper, I think, has been to China, Kenny Garrett, a number of big name people who are not just going there, but actually staying there for a while, you know, sort of enveloping, you know, Chinese culture, reflecting it back to them, you know, giving something to the students who are there, but they're also learning as well too, right? They're also not standing still. They're getting something from China, and China's getting something from them as well, right?
Yeah, I think this is a really healthy space for us to be in the sense of understanding that we're constantly in the space of connection and borrowing, and that the creative space that jazz offers us. And even more so, thinking of my student body in my classes, like their presence of their culture within this music, right? Their sense of, I actually have a place within this. My American heritage and my Asian heritage has a presence in this music. We have several more questions from our audience that I think we should attend to. Emily, what's next?
Yes, the questions are coming in. Everyone is clearly very fascinated by this documentary and wants to learn more. So there are a couple of questions that are also kind of interested in this theme of cultural blending. And so maybe I can try to ask a couple of them at once. So one comes from our East Asian Studies librarian, Ying Zhang, who writes, Marquitas, congratulations. She says, Shanghai is well known for blending Western and Eastern cultures. Were there any jazz music that was being publicly performed on a Chinese instrument in the first half of the 20th century? Did you come across anything like that in the course of your research?
I know in the first half of the 20th century, I didn't come across any of that. And there's probably, it may be there, but there's probably a number of reasons why it's not there. And that's because I think there is this this space where some Chinese, even for Westerners, felt that jazz music was kind of primitive, right? And Chinese music was also seen as something that was primitive and not modern. And so for many Chinese people of that era, you know, they were very, they had a predilection towards Western music, right? Classical music, piano, violin. These were the instruments that were the culture, the high culture, right? So there was sort of a push against traditional Chinese instruments in that sense. There's the same way there's this push against jazz as being barbaric and primitive and not high level, high culture music, right? So I think in the later half of the 20th century, you do get Chinese musicians who are using traditional Chinese instruments like not the pipa or the oboe or the flute, the Chinese flute, but you do get that. And there are still some musicians now in China who are using traditional Chinese instruments like the zither and different things like that. Interestingly enough, in the 1950s, the late 50s, early 60s, you get African-American musicians are using Chinese instruments in jazz. And probably the first person to really do that was a man by the name of Yusef Lateef. And Yusef Lateef on one of his albums is using several traditional Chinese flutes on that album. So in a sense of like world music, he was probably one of the first to really start proponents of this, you know, using instruments from various different regions in the world to sort of express himself. So you still do have musicians doing that, but I'm not sure if Chinese musicians were doing that in the early part of the 20th century. And Yusef would be Y-U-S-E-F.
So your comment that jazz music was kind of looked down upon originally segues into another question that we received. This question was asked by Jason Rivera, and he writes, in jazz music's infancy, mainstream American culture viewed it as inferior because of its strong connection to Black culture. This meant that white jazz musicians helped to make jazz, quote unquote, acceptable to the white middle class. Did Chinese musicians play kind of a similar role in accepting jazz music into Chinese culture?
I think that on the one hand, there is this sort of process of Sinicization, right? Where, you know, it's always better if people who look like us are doing this music. It makes it, it paves the way for some people, but I don't think that is necessarily the case in China in that sense, because even those Chinese musicians who were playing jazz were looked down upon by other Chinese people. And I think this is also a holdover for the kind of societal view of musicians and actors, period, especially during that period. But I think that the music itself was sort of repudiated because the origins of its coming from Black people, and Blackness was African, you know, and there was a lot of otherizing going on there. And so I think it didn't matter who played it. The music itself was just not something that was considered highbrow for middle-class, polite society in China, right?
Amma, did you want to ask another question, or should we forge ahead with audience Q&A?
Yes, let's get into the meat of the Q&A since we're there right now. Yes.
So this question is kind of interested in the longue durée relationship between African Americans in China and the Chinese population. So Edward Watson writes, how has the acceptance or lack thereof and subsequent interaction of African American jazz music and musicians by the larger Chinese population changed from the pre-1949 period to the post-1980 period? So how did the interaction between African-American jazz musicians and the Chinese population change over the course of the 20th century?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I don't think those initial African-American musicians who came to China in the early part of the 20th century, none of them spoke Chinese. None of them, I think they were all working and operating through either translators, interpreters, or, you know, hand gestures, but none of them spoke Chinese. So it would be very difficult for them to really get to know like Chinese people, and probably difficult for Chinese people to get to know them. Now, one of the things that I did see in the archive, and that you had a number of Japanese people as well as Russian people who became a part of this sort of coterie of like hanger-ons with these jazz musicians, right? So there was this sort of international coterie of like, you know, Black jazz musicians and Filipino jazz musicians and Japanese jazz musicians that were all like hanging out in the same spaces. But not once have I read something about Chinese musicians hanging out with this group of people, right? I was looking for it and trying to find it, and I couldn't. Forward to, and then after 1949, jazz was so repudiated by the Communist Party that even when they created films, when the Chinese Communist Party created films, with the soundtrack, as one musician said, anytime you had an enemy on the screen or someone who was a negative character come on the screen, they would use jazz music to introduce that character, right? So it was seen as part of the old society. Everything that was wrong with society and that was backwards, licentious, jazz took the fall and the brunt for that. Fast forward to 1981, you had two African-American musicians, Willie Ruff and Dwight Mitchell. When Dwight was a piano player, Willie Ruff played the upright bass and the piano. They had met the vice president, I think, of the Shanghai Conservatory of Music on his travels in the US in 1980. And he invited the two to come to Shanghai whenever they could. So Willie Ruff, who was at Yale University before he retired, raised money. He took Chinese for 6 months, and he and his partner flew to Shanghai to give a master class in jazz. And Willie Ruff says that I wanted to speak to Chinese students in Chinese to teach them and tell them about jazz music, right? So, you know, he spent 6 months learning Chinese, had all the stuff written down. And so he's speaking to, you know, this Chinese audience in the best Chinese he could muster. But I think the people really appreciated that. And this clip is on YouTube. And the only reason why it's not in the film was that I tried to contact Mr. Ruff for like 2 years to get permission to use that clip in the documentary, but I could never get a hold of him. But in this clip, the students seem to be most interested in like improvisation. Improv was the thing that they were in disbelief about. How can you create new music on the spur of the moment? We don't believe you. And so Willie Ruff says, okay, well, I'll invite a Chinese student, come to the piano, play a piece that we've never heard before, something that only you would know about. So a student comes up, plays a piece on the piano, and then Dwight Mitchell gets to the piano, plays the piece back almost verbatim, and then they launch into this improvisation of this Chinese student's piece. It was brilliant, and the entire room's just, you know, applauding like this event. After that, you have several other jazz musicians who come to China in the 1980s. And one of these books I've read, there's a list of musicians who come, and they're all giving like master classes as well too. So you have some interaction there, and the interaction is taking place slowly, but it's still the 1980s, the early 90s. I don't see truly a large number of African-American jazz musicians going back to China until like the early 2000s. Late 90s, early 2000s is where I see like, oh, this is a place to come. And it definitely picks up after the Beijing Olympics in 2008. However, one of the things that I didn't include in the documentary, again, just because of time, one of the musicians was talking about, he was playing in this band. There were 2 African-Americans, 2 Chinese persons, and then 1 white guy in the band. And he said that they just did not have, there was a problem in the band with the relationship between the Chinese musicians and the African-American musicians. They weren't communicating with each other. I don't know if it was a linguistic problem or what, but he talked about this in great length in the interview. I just didn't have time to include it in the documentary. So to the question about relationships, I think that there are going to be people who like African Americans because they like African American culture, because there's some kind of affinity with that culture or with people. And then there may be some people who just don't. I've had both experiences in China, right? I've had people to like me because they like a certain aspect of African American culture. They want to get to know me, and that was the starting point, right? On the flip side, I've had people who have not wanted to have a relationship with me or not get to know me for whatever reasons, or preconceived notions they may have about me as a Black person, right? So I think you get both of those in China. So whether or not it's gotten better, I really can't speak to that. I just know that the relationships can be fraught, but I think jazz was a really great medium for bridging those gaps, right?
I love that idea of jazz as this kind of social lubricant bringing different people together. So we are very close to the end of the hour. And so maybe just as a kind of wrap-up question, you got two questions about the future. So one is curious about what the future of the Chinese jazz scene is going to look like. And the second is interested in what your next project is going to be. So maybe they will be related. How will you answer the questions about looking ahead?
Yeah, the future is, to be honest with you, is going to be whatever that particular government allows, right? There's a great movement that's going on in Shanghai right now, a great mix of different musicians, and whether or not they're going to be allowed to continue to create and continue to operate independently, I don't know. But I do think that more than any place I've been in the past 10, 15 years, like there's definitely a passion for the music. The last time I was there, I went to the Shanghai Jazz Festival, and it was, it was standing room only, for a lot of the music. And it wasn't just, Western players. There were like Chinese players on the bandstand and playing. And so I think there's a lot of potential for a lot of growth. I think people are interested in the music. So I think that I have nothing but positive things to say about potentially what China can be, that one of the next capitals of, the music. And that's kind of, Shanghai can rather, and that's exciting. The last question about my next project, I'm 70%, 80% through with the second documentary. And the second documentary is called Sunrise in the West. And it's about the Asian American jazz movement. It's a very little known movement of Asian Americans and African American jazz musicians in the Bay Area who are collaborating and working together and creating music that is pushing social justice movements, right? For not only African Americans, but for Asian people as well too, right? And they've been doing this since like the 1970s, right? So the next documentary is about, it's their story, this collaboration between, Black musicians, some of them who are biracial, half Japanese, half Black, half, or Asian, and just this collaboration of people in the Bay Area who've worked on some phenomenal music in this great social musical movement that, that most of us don't know about. So that's the next project, and I'm excited to get it out there, and we're almost done with it.
That sounds great. We'll have to have you back when it's out. Amma, did you have anything to say by way of wrapping up, or?
Just thank you. It's just fascinating. And I hope my students have found this magic hour to be exactly that. And I look forward to the next part of your journey, because it truly is unique, and what you're bringing into the world we would otherwise not know about. So thank you for doing the work you're doing.
Appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Great. So we are just about out of time. Again, I would really like to thank Dr. Marquitas Presswood for joining us today and for answering all of these questions so thoughtfully and eloquently, and also for making Yellow Jazz Black music available for us to watch for free. And I'd also like to thank Dr. S. Amare for helping to moderate this event and thinking through a lot of these questions with me. Thanks to all of you for tuning in, and hopefully I will see you at our next event. All right. So